Is certainly, in 2014, it's certainly a choose-your-own-adventure story with about as many different ways to publish as there are different kinds of things to publish. Yes?
Excuse me. We have a student who wishes to record this.
Oh, yeah. I recognize you.
Great.
I know like half the people in the room. This is your life in teaching, almost, in here. So I'm going to cover two different sort of models of publishing, which isn't to say there aren't 200 more. And it varies completely depending on the form you're publishing, whether you're publishing short stories or novels or poetry, and then even within the individual forms, it can depend greatly on the type of that form you're publishing. For example, a romance novelist isn't going to follow the same path necessarily as somebody who's publishing literary fiction in the short form, somebody who's doing short stories. So there's a lot of variation, but I think we can look at two models, and I'll give you a handout in a minute after I kind of run through these. I'll give you these two models. The two models are traditional publishing, which is sort of the way it's been done, right, for 100 years, and the way that when I was first starting to write, this is the way that I assumed it had to be done. Happily, I think that's changing now. Some people call this legacy publishing. I don't like that word, legacy publishing, because it implies that there's some sort of death coming, and I don't think that's true. I think the traditional way of publishing will remain. It just won't be the only way anymore. It's certainly not the only way anymore. Then the other model I want to talk about I've called alt-pub, and I don't really know why, other than it sounded cool. And it's really just sort of the way to go about this if you don't care to pursue the traditional or sort of legacy way of publishing, or if you realize that for what you are writing, maybe you're writing flash fiction, maybe you're writing lyric essays in creative nonfiction, right? Maybe you're writing a kind of poetry that isn't going to land in poetry magazine, and so you've got to seek other outlets. What's nice is that now there are these other outlets, and they can be found, right? And you can develop a kind of a readership and even a fan base, if you will, for these sorts of things. Okay, so traditional publishing. So the way that this was done for most of the 20th century, and is still quite a bit these days, is that young writers, and I'll use fiction writers as my primary example because that's what I know, fiction and nonfiction. So prose narrative, basically. You write stories, you write essays, you send them around to literary magazines, or now you submit them online, you cross your fingers, and you wait, right? 5 weeks, 10 weeks, 20 weeks, 30 weeks, 40 weeks, until you get a response back, and then you celebrate because you've got a pub, and then you write the next story or essay, and rinse and repeat. And you just keep sending them out. And well, where do you send them? How do you know where to send them? Well, that's a bit of a crapshoot, but one of the pieces of advice that I've found helpful is if you find a collection of stories or essays from a favorite writer of yours, look to the front matter, look at the first few pages of the collection, and see where your writer published her stories and her essays. There's a list usually, probably if there's 10 stories in the collection, anywhere between 4 and 6 of them have been published in literary magazines prior to the publication of the book. Well, those places are listed in the front matter of the book. So it's Tin House, it's New Yorker, it's McSweeney's, it's Glimmer Train, right? It's all these places, and then you think, okay, well, this is where writers who I admire are publishing. Maybe we're in the same kind of aesthetic ballpark. What the magazines will tell you is read a copy, read 3 copies of art, and the reality is that, yes, you do want to glance, especially if they have excerpts online, but the truth is you're not going to have time to read 3 or 4 copies of every literary journal that you want to publish in, until you get to the point where you've maybe narrowed the list down to just 2 or 3. But that's probably down the road. I think the faster way to narrow your list is to find where your writers are publishing, where the people you admire are placing their work, and start there. Right? Start there. And that'll allow you to discover maybe journals you didn't know existed before. Right? And what that did for me when I first started doing this was I realized, oh, some of my favorite writers are publishing in places that I didn't think they would publish. You know, when I was first in grad school, Annie Proulx and Rick Bass were sort of hot at the time, right? They were and when I discovered that Annie Proulx and Rick Bass were willing to publish in certain places that I thought were not quite prestigious enough, that kind of opened my eyes to the fact that it kind of depends on the journals that you like. It's maybe you've got a relationship with people who have published there or have worked there. Maybe you just admire this journal, and even if it's not considered an A-list journal, maybe you just really admire their aesthetic and you want your work in that journal. So you do enough of these, and then eventually you have a handful of stories published, and then the traditional path would say, now you gather all your essays or stories together into a manuscript, and you start sending it out to contests, right? And you try to win some kind of short story collection prize that includes publishing your collection of short stories as a book. And so this is a very common path. And then once that gets published, somewhere in the process of that being published and you winning the prize, agents begin to notice you. Or maybe agents have already started noticing you because of the places that you're publishing in. And believe it or not, agents do scroll through these literary magazines somehow. Somehow they have time in between reading 5,000 pages of manuscript on the train. They're actually looking at literary magazines too, which blows my mind. We think we have a lot of reading. But they do. They will find you in these literary magazines, and then they will contact you, which is kind of amazing. So then the agent contacts you because your short stories are so good, but the first question she says is, do you have a novel? And you're like, oh no, I'm a short story writer. Right? But what she wants is for you to write a novel, because even though short stories are wonderful in their beautiful form, novels are what sell, right? They want novels. And so then you start the traditional path again, as you start working on a novel. Or maybe you've been working on a novel, right? Or maybe like an instructor of mine once a long time ago, you lie to the agent and say, sure, I have a novel. And then you start writing your novel as quickly as you can, right? Because you don't want her to hang up. She looks at the novel, she agrees to represent it, and you start submitting it around to different publishers, publishing houses. Usually the major houses first, and then maybe some of the smaller presses, and then maybe even college presses. Now here's where we start to get into a lot of variation, because you don't have to have an agent, you don't have to acquire an agent through publishing short stories or winning short story contests. You can simply write a novel, make sure it's very good, and then start sending what are called queries, emails that basically give an elevator pitch of your novel. And agents read these queries, and lots and lots and lots of books get represented because of emails that come in through this query system, and agents read these little emails that usually contain a brief description of the novel, a little bit of a biography of you, maybe just a bit about where you published before, or if you've had some kind of education in writing or what else you've done. And then if they're interested, at that point they'll ask for the first 50 pages of the book. So you send them the first 50 pages of the book, then massive amounts of time pass while you stress out, and then they come back and they say, send me the rest of the book. And then double the massive amount of time passes, right? And if all goes happily, the agent says, yes, I want to represent this, and then that process starts. So let's say the book gets sold to a major house. Let's say FSG buys your book, right? And now you're full of joy and happiness, and the publishing house will hopefully help you finance a little bit of a book tour. They will ideally start to do some marketing. They will push advanced copies to various critics and reviewers who will hopefully review your book in the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and the LA Review of Books. And you'll be incredibly famous and rich. Not really. But at least you'll feel like maybe you should be. And that's kind of how the traditional path has gone in the most idealistic version, right? And then if your sales aren't terrible, they'll let you publish a second novel and a third novel, and the next thing you know, you're called rock. And so that's the traditional path. That's the way that people have imagined it has had to be, and it can still be done that way, right? It can still be done that way. So the writer that I thought was sort of the most representative of this path today would be Jonathan Franzen. And the reason I picked Franzen is because he is kind of intentionally avoiding anything to do with the alt-pub model that I'm about to go over now. He's not on Twitter, he's not on Facebook, he's not publishing in sort of back alley literary magazines. He's almost pretending like it is 1976 and he's determined to stay there. Now, I happen to be a fan of his work, and so I think he can do whatever he wants, right? He doesn't have to interact with his readers. He doesn't have to acknowledge that the 21st century has arrived because he's good enough, right, that he doesn't have to. He doesn't need to. When his next novel comes out, lots of people are going to buy it, right? And a lot of them are going to criticize him in the book, but they'll all have a copy of it in their bag. And so that's probably all he cares about. But he's a good example of somebody that's sort of a representative of the legacy version or the traditional version. Okay, so what's the other way of doing this? Well, the other way of doing this is much harder to define in the steps that I outlined for traditional publishing. The alt-pub way is to publish a lot. Flash fiction, regular short stories, excerpts from novels, to publish them in an infinite variety of places, to publish them in e-zines, to publish them on your own blogs or other people's blogs, to publish them on literary magazines that exist exclusively online. Some writers now are starting to publish shorts on Twitter, one tweet at a time, which is kind of annoying, frankly, if you're following these writers and you're on a social media platform and they decide that this is now going to become a platform for you to read their work. It's like, well, no, this isn't exactly what I want. But it is drawing attention to them. It is drawing in new readers. It is creating a buzz about their name. So all of these newer literary magazines have online versions, and the online versions publish either more stuff than the print versions do or different kinds of stuff than the print versions do. Electric Lit, The Millions, Rumpus, there's just an infinite list of these places. And the idea here is that the more your name appears in these places and the more people are retweeting a link to your work and the more people are talking about your work, primarily online, right, the more kind of a buzz there is, so that when you do get to the point where you release what you might consider to be a larger work or a more substantial work, like a collection of stories or a novel or a collection of interconnected poems, you've got this base, right, this kind of reader base and network of writer friends that you've cultivated primarily through social media, through Facebook, through Twitter, through Goodreads, the website. There's other versions of Goodreads that I can't think of right now, but Goodreads is sort of a big one. And this works the same way, because so here's where you can start to cross over. Because if you've published a lot and you've got what agents call a platform, which means, let's say you've got 5,000 Twitter followers and sort of proven that people are interested in reading your stuff and your stuff is good, now you can maybe jump over toward the traditional model and start emailing queries to agents about your novel and see if you can't just insert yourself into the traditional path. This is where it gets really, really messy in a way, right? This is where it's hard to sort of show a clearly delineated path forward, because you can begin to mix and match different things. A friend of mine named Eric Schonkweiler just published a book called Above All Men, and he published it through a micro press called Midwestern Gothic. And the micro press for Midwestern Gothic was basically the product of a literary magazine staff that decided one day, we want to publish some novels, right? And it's a very tiny staff, and most of them are volunteers, and they don't have a lot of money, and they certainly don't have the power of a big New York publishing house. But they found Eric's work through this alt-pub sort of method. He had been publishing he'd been publishing a novella in serialized form through an online literary magazine, and they happened to see one of the excerpts. So this micropress offered him a deal, put their staff to work on editing and copy editing his work, worked with him in much the same way that a traditional press would work with people. In fact, you can make the argument now that the big heavy hitters, they don't even want to help you. The editors at Random House or Little Brown, they don't have time to help you reshape your material. Your agent is supposed to do that. And what you present to the publisher is supposed to be a finished product. But these smaller presses, right, which are not answering to shareholders or a corporate board of directors, they have time to actually work with the writers. And so this really opened my eyes. It just happened in the last year. Eric's book came out and it looks great. The object itself is wonderful. Of course, it's available on Kindle and through all of the electronic means of distribution, but it's also available. Now, the thing that he doesn't have is it's not sitting on the shelf at Barnes & Noble. And so that's the one disadvantage, I would say. But they also set up a book tour for him, which was extremely impressive. He started in, oh my God, I'm going blank. Where was AWP? Was it Portland or Seattle? I didn't go this year. Nobody went. Seattle. Was it Seattle? So he started in Seattle at AWP, and then he worked his way down the coast. He had readings in significant bookstores in Sacramento and LA and San Diego, and then he went to Tucson and Albuquerque and Dallas, and then he worked his way up through the Midwest. He read at Prairie Lights in Iowa City, which you guys know, the mythical wonder associated with the University of Iowa's writing workshop. Prairie Lights is this kind of mythical place in American creative writing. He got to read there. So they set up this wonderful book tour for him. Now, the caveat is that he was driving himself in his own car and his books were in a box in the trunk. Right? So he didn't have this fancy entourage, you know, of New York publicists in black turtlenecks following him along. I mean, he was with him and a couple of buddies were basically on this book tour. Sounded like they had a blast. Sounded like he sold a lot of books. He generated quite a buzz for the novel. It got a review in the LA Review of Books because he got it noticed. Whether that means he's going to get picked up by a major or not, I don't even think he cares at this point, right? He's published a book that he respects. He's got a readership that he's building, and he's happy with it. And the reason I say that that was a surprise to me is because really up until Eric's experience, I had sort of lumped the micro presses in with self-publishing, which is to say I didn't have a lot of respect for it, which is probably a product of me being old, right? But the fact is that, you know, if you are self-publishing and then self-copy editing and you're not working in sort of a collaborative environment with other people who love words and love your story, it just feels to me like you're probably not getting the most out of your work. And you're certainly not getting the kind of exposure that you might if there's a staff somewhere helping you, right? Because frankly, as writers, you don't have time to spend 9-10 hours a day on marketing. Or hopefully you don't have time to spend 9 or 10 hours a day on marketing. But this micropress did such an amazing job. Midwestern Gothic did such an amazing job for Eric that I was sort of sold on the idea that these, now we've had independent presses for a long time. We've had Grey Wolf, we've had Milkweed, and those are very prestigious presses. They're not majors, but they come out with beautiful books. They have great writers. There's a new collection of essays called the Empathy Exams that just came out from Grey Wolf, I think. And people are just going crazy over this collection. Yeah, I haven't read it yet, but it's getting a tremendous amount of buzz. Another micropress is called Tiny Hardcore, which was begun by the writer Roxane Gay. And Roxane is the writer I sort of picked to represent this alt pub model, in that she has sort of fashioned her career in a way that's more in line with this second sort of set of values or expectations, and never really has tried to necessarily plug into the traditional or the legacy model, and as a result probably saved herself a lot of time. So for fiction, for nonfiction, for novels, for stories, those are two models that you can at least conceptualize, as long as you're sort of open to the idea that they're changing constantly, that they are not mutually exclusive by any means, that you can follow one path and then suddenly switch to the other path, or you can mix and match the paths to make your own path. There's not one way to do it anymore. It would almost be simpler if there were. But you know what it would also be? It would also mean that we would have less writers to read, we would have less kinds of stories and essays and poems to consider. There would be fewer writers that we would be aware of, you know, with the Ernest Hemingway on the cover of Time magazine, and we'd all wish we were hunting lions or something, even though you feel like that doesn't have anything to do with your work. You know, for a lot of writers that would be discouraging because you think, oh, I gotta hunt lions, or they won't publish my novel, and that's just not true anymore. So I think ultimately it's a very, very good thing. It's just a confusing thing. And what adds to the problem for you guys is that at the stage of your writing career, you probably shouldn't be thinking about publishing at all. You should probably be thinking about writing well, right? And writing as much stuff that's good as you can, and then very slowly allowing the problem of publishing to enter into your consciousness. I think a lot of young writers get swamped by the complication of publishing and stop thinking about their writing entirely. And the thing that both of these models have in common is that if your stuff's not any good, nobody's going to care. If your stuff's not any good, nobody's going to publish you. Right? Nobody's going to put you on their e-zine. Nobody's going to publish you in their online version of their literary magazine. You know, no agent's going to ask for a partial if the writing doesn't blow his socks off. So it's a little complicated and tricky, but there's certainly more opportunities than ever before, I think. So, with that in mind, what are some questions that you have? I think we were going to set aside a few minutes for...
A lot of time for questions. It should be a discussion. We have an expert, obviously, in the field, one who teaches writing, one who has gone through the publishing paths. So now you really need to take advantage of his time that he has given to us for this kind of project.
Yeah.
How long was it that you did it take you for your first publication?
Think about that. Well, I was overeager, and I started sending stuff out while I was taking my first graduate workshop. And so I think from the time that I started trying to write seriously, it was about 2 years. It was about 2 years, and I published a story, but I can't even remember the name of it. Parts. It was called Parts in the Oxford Review. And it was funny because the first few places I sent that story, it was rejected. And at the time, I was convinced that that meant I was done. If this story doesn't land, that means that this is all a waste. And at the time, I was working with Lee Martin, who's now the director of creative writing at Ohio State, and was a Pulitzer finalist 4 years ago. And he laughed, and he said, "You're going to write so many more stories than this." And I think he did say something like, "You won't even remember this one," or maybe he said, "You won't remember the title of this one." And it's funny, because just a minute ago, I didn't remember the title of it. But yeah, you can't help but think that everything is at stake the first time you send things out, right? And that's why a lot of people are reluctant to send things out. It's like, oh my God, if I send it out and they don't take it, I'm doomed, right? But then you got to remember, Flannery O'Connor sent a story to 27 journals before one finally took it. 27 journals, which is a sort of stamina and fortitude that I can't even conceive of. I've never sent a story to 27 journals. Usually I give up after, I don't know, if 13 or 14 places don't take it, then I just get pouty and I stop sending it around. Even though I know that Flannery O'Connor sent her first story to 27 journals and it was the 28th that took it, I still don't have the fortitude to do that. You really have to have such a thick skin. You have to be able to blow off rejection like it's just nothing, like it means nothing, right? And really it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that that particular editor on that particular day for that particular journal didn't find your work ideal for that particular issue of that particular journal, right? And it's a bit of a numbers game. But yeah, I'd say 2 years, which probably was too early. Probably was too early to start. Because then once you get one accepted, then you're like, oh, I can do this. This is fun. Right? And then now you're sending stuff out. And that was at the time where submittable.com did not exist. And so everything was going in an envelope with a self-addressed stamped envelope, right, with a cover letter that you had to print, and you had to make sure that all pages actually printed. And you had to buy postage, and then you had to drive to the post office. Now you almost never have to submit anything over snail mail. There's a handful of journals that don't have online submissions, but most of them either use submittable.com or they use some form of the software on their own website that allows you to upload a file. If you're on Twitter, which I strongly recommend you get on Twitter, even if you're sort of philosophically opposed to social media, if you're a writer, you just get over it. You're going to have to be on Twitter at some point.
Why is that? In, 30 seconds or less.
Because that is where readers are gathering. And that is where they are talking about books. That is where they are talking about stories, good or bad.
In a particular, should they be following somebody or
follow the
something?
writers you like.
Okay.
They're all there. Even Stephen King gave in and joined Twitter 2 months ago, right? And already got himself into a little bit of a dust-up with some people, which was amazing to me because I would think if anybody would be above the fray, it would be Stephen King. But yeah, look for writers you like. Look for people that you've met in workshops. Magazines that you admire. They're all on Twitter. And the reason I thought about Twitter was that submittable.com has a Twitter account, and they are constantly tweeting new literary journals that are starting, or contest deadlines that are coming up, or other opportunities to send in your work. When magazines are maybe doing a theme issue, submittable.com will tweet that, Open Letters is doing a theme issue on the city. And so you're thinking, okay, I'm working on something that's set in an urban place or deals with urban issues, and you're like, okay, so that's my target. I've got to have this done by April 20th, right? Because that's their deadline or whatever. So, yeah, I think these kind of advantages are really helpful for writers because it can help you sort of formulate a game plan. But Facebook, I don't think is as essential as Twitter. I mean, I think that it doesn't hurt to be on Facebook, and certainly, get exposure on Facebook. But it does seem like Twitter is becoming the new salon, at least in American lit, and there's a lot of English writers on there as well. So yeah. So you'll waste a lot of time on Twitter and not get any writing done.
I feel like of all the things that I was expecting you to maybe say, get on Twitter is like the least.
Yeah, no, I hate to say it because it's such a time sink.
Yeah.
And as you know, I'm not on Facebook anymore because Facebook was just too much of a time sink. But I'm working on a novel now, and if I sell the novel, I know for a fact that I'll have to reactivate my Facebook account. And I know for a fact that I'll have to kind of sort of reanimate my Goodreads account, and I'll have to be present in all these sort of platforms, not because it's a good idea, but because the people who work at the publishers are going to demand it. On top of that, they're going to make me bring my blog back to life. They're going to demand that I have X number of entries per month on the blog. There's so much online work that you have to do to kind of maintain a presence and a name, and you just can't say no because they kind of require it. There's no way around it, unfortunately. Lee Martin, my friend Lee, who taught at UNT for a while, I always laugh because I know Lee doesn't want to do any of this stuff. He doesn't want to be on Twitter. He doesn't want to be on Facebook. He doesn't want to post to his blog. He wants to write books, which he does on a fairly regular basis. But because he's forced to do it, he writes these beautiful blog posts, which are clearly things that he spent a lot of time editing and shaping and polishing, and I read them and I'm thinking, man, these are the most pristine blog posts in the history. And I want to say, Lee, it's just a blog. You can't spend 5 hours preparing a blog. But I know that for him, that anything that's under his name has to be at a certain sort of level of quality. And so he's putting a tremendous amount of time into doing all this stuff. All, I'm sure, at the behest of people in marketing, PR, for his publisher that says, okay, look, we're going to come out with this book, but you got to pitch in. And this is true even for the majors. Even the majors now expect writers to shoulder a lot of the weight of publicity, marketing, and kind of social media presence. That's just how it is now. Salinger would never get away with hiding Yeah.
So what would you tweet?
Well, what I tweet is just general nonsense. But I try to make it. I try to make it entertaining nonsense when I can, or I tweet about what I'm reading. I tweet a lot about what I'm reading. Sometimes I tweet about problems in writing, but not very often because I think it's boring. And the idea is that you do that, and you develop this followers, and you develop a network of other writers and people who like to read, people who are also fans of whatever you were reading. I tweet about movies. I tweet about my favorite TV shows, and then the payoff is that when you get a story accepted, and you remind everybody 2 or 3 times that your story has been accepted, and then 4 months from then you remind them that the issue with your story has just come out. And if they like your tweets and they think that you're somebody that's kind of aesthetically related to them, they'll go check out your story, or hopefully buy your book. Again, I go back to my friend Eric. He really did this very well, as he kind of cultivated a Twitter following through just being himself online and developing this kind of network of readers and writers and people who like the same kind of reading. And then when his book was out, he took advantage of it. He had a built-in audience. He had that platform, as agents call it, of people he could market the book to, right? And he was really judicious about not overwhelming his Twitter feed with spam, but his book tour, he updated about the book tour probably 2 or 3 times a day, told us what cities he was in, who he was reading with that day, a comment about the weather in the city. He did a really, really nice job of subtle marketing so that it didn't feel like you were getting spammed to death. I'm sure there are people making a lot of money teaching the subtle art of social media marketing, because most people fail at it, right? Most people who are just kind of blunt marketers on social media, they get unfollowed very quickly. You guys have seen this. They're clearly not there to interact with people. They're just there to sell a product. And that's kind of a violation of the ethics of the platform in a way, right? That's going just a little bit too far. But I think the platform will let you get away with kind of gentle, occasional mentioning of your work that is coming out or your book tour that is ongoing and that sort of thing. Yeah.
So you primarily went through traditional publishing?
Yeah, I was convinced that I had to follow the 1955 model for whatever reason, and I had a list of for my first novel, the best agents, the most powerful and glorious agents who would sell my book to the most powerful and glorious publishers. And I didn't want to hear about independent presses. I didn't want to hear about college presses. I didn't want to hear about micro presses. And that was really dumb. That was really dumb. That was, not that I shouldn't have done that, but I should have been also willing to do other avenues. But what I had been doing for the 4 or 5 years it took me to write that book was I had been intentionally ignoring changes in publishing and sort of blocking myself off from seeing how publishing was changing. And the idea was that I just got to write this book, and it's got to be good. And then when I'm done writing the book, if it's good enough, I'll figure out publishing then. Like, it was very compartmentalized thinking. And even that I don't necessarily think is the wrong way to do it. It's just that when I finally emerged from that book, when I came up for air, the publishing world had changed radically. So I got my MFA in 2005. The book that I wrote was kind of a second version of my MFA thesis. When I was done with it, really, it was 2008-ish, 2009, and things had changed so much from the time I went into MFA school till the time that I finished Remedy Wheel. It was like a whole different landscape. It had changed completely. Like when I went into MFA school, all this alt-pub stuff was in its infancy. It was not respected, and frankly, there wasn't a lot of good writing associated with it. By the time I finished Remedy Wheel, it was more or less where we are now, which is there's a lot of great writers following these electronic paths. There's a lot of great work coming out this way. The majors are maybe getting a little moldy and stilted. And I think there's a lot of agents now that are trying to take advantage of this new way. The problem for them is that this new way doesn't really have a place for them. agents were traditionally the gatekeepers to big publishing, and the alt pub model doesn't really have a gate, except the editors of the journals that you're trying to appear in, right, or the chief editor of the micro press where you want your book to come out from. So it's tricky, but yeah, I made my list of agents. I sent my queries out. I tracked it all on a spreadsheet. I kind of did it the way that you were supposed to do it, and I don't regret that. I mean, you take whatever path you have to take to get where you're going to go. But for the second novel, I'm obviously just much more open to where it might come from and who might read it and what the various avenues are. But I will admit, you still want to find a way to get your book on the shelf at Barnes & Noble. You do, right? You do, because people are walking in there and they're looking at the cover and they're like, oh, this looks good. And if it's in that new fiction section or if it's in staff picks, that's a way to get more readers, but it's not the only way. And I don't even know if it's the best way anymore. I don't even know if it's the best way. I don't even know if those sort of terms apply. I mean, how many of you have bought a book in a brick and mortar bookstore in the last 6 months? Raise your hand. How many of you have bought a book online in the last 6 weeks? Yeah. I'm going to regret the demise of the brick and mortar bookstore, but I think it's coming. Maybe the small independent bookstores will rise up in place of Barnes & Noble. That might be even better. Actually, that might be better for all of us as readers. Yeah.
A question.
Sure.
I noticed you really emphasize good writing.
Yeah.
And I also noticed when you were talking about agents and how really the purpose, at one point you said, the purpose of an agent sometimes is really to help you get the most out of your writing.
Yeah.
And to make the writing as best as it can be. What would you advise for students who are, undergraduates, I'd say undergraduates, we have a large undergraduate contingency in Sigma Tau Delta who are creative writers. So maybe they take, a couple classes per semester, but over the summer they're not in class or workshop. Is there a way, or what would you suggest for students to get the most out of their writing when they're not in workshop and they don't have an agent yet?
Yeah, well, I think the most valuable thing to come out of your workshops in college is a couple of people who read you well. Which isn't to say the people who compliment you the most. It's the people who read you well. The 2 or 3 people who read you well, right? So if you go through 2 or 3 workshops, ideally you've collected the names and email addresses of 3 or even 4 people who are serious about writing and who are also looking for people to trade manuscripts with. And over the summer, you either trade manuscripts electronically, or if you're in the same city, you trade manuscripts and then you sit down together and you hold a little impromptu workshop. But over the course of your life, even after you're out of college, even by the time you're as famous as Philip Roth, you're still going to need a little group of first readers. These 3 or 4 people that you send the manuscript to when you feel like it's at a stage where you can't make it any better, but it's not ready to go to the agent or the editor or wherever else. These are the people who are willing to tell you the truth, right? Who expect the same from you when they send you their stuff, so you've got this sort of mutually beneficial relationship. But over the summer, I think you cultivate that very small group of friends that are willing to read your stuff and give you direct and honest feedback. And if you end up in the academy for various, which we didn't even address because that's such a completely. It's not a completely different path, but it's got like 18 different roads leading out from both sides of my model. But if you do wind up teaching, you have to take advantage of summers. You have to take advantage of summers. You have to write during the summer. You have to plan vacations in such a way that they don't get in the way of your summer. You can't think about summer as a vacation. Actually, summer is anything but a vacation. Better to think about summer as like a starter's gun going off. And you have 12.3 weeks. Is that what it is? Is that right? God, it makes it seem like nothing. Shouldn't have said that. You have 3 months. 3 whole months. Now I'm depressing myself. to get some momentum built up, right? You get some momentum built up, and then once you've got the momentum built up, when you're back in grad school, when you're back teaching, you can keep your writing going because you've got some momentum, even if you can't spend as many hours a day as you were in July. But yeah, the writing has to be good. The writing, it doesn't matter who you know. It doesn't matter if you went to NYU. I've heard agents say they don't even want their clients to live in New York anymore because that means the client's going to want to go to lunch. Your agent doesn't want to go to lunch because it's really busy, right? And so they don't care where you are. When you send those query emails in, they don't know where the query came from. You could be in Texas, you could be in Alaska, you could be on the moon. All they care about is, does this sound like something I can sell? Does this sound like a promising young writer? Am I intrigued by the story and these characters? It used to be you move to New York, you go to parties, get to know people. And it's not that that would hurt. I'm not saying that that would hurt you now, but it's not at all necessary. It's not at all necessary. And in fact, there's a lot of ways you could say that a young writer moving to New York now would be a disastrous decision. Because how are you going to pay for that apartment? And how are you going to get along with your 17 roommates? Right? Yeah. I mean, I think that if your idea is I'm going to be a writer in New York, then the thing to do is to publish a couple of books, right? Have a little bit, and then go to New York, and then be very writerly in Park Slope. Go to brunch, and behave as a writer would having brunch, whatever that is. But you don't have to be there anymore. You don't have to be in Chicago. You don't have to be in LA. I think there's advantages to being in cities where there's a lot going on and there's a lot of creative people. There's a lot of advantages. It's just not required. It's just not required. You write wherever you are. Yeah?
What do you think about self-publishing ebooks?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think the expectations have to be realistic, which is that most people who self-publish don't make a dent. Most things that are notice I'm not saying all by any means, but I'm saying most things that are self-published are not very good. And I think the reason is either that the writer is someone who's very impatient to publish and hasn't learned his or her craft very well yet, or maybe it is somebody that's a pretty decent writer, but that lack of collaboration, that lack of having an editor who believes in the story and helps you to realize the full potential of the story is missing, and so I see so many of these self-published ebooks with spelling errors and grammatical mistakes and giant plot holes, and I think there are so many ways to publish now in collaboration with other people that self-publishing should be the last resort. I'm also aware that that makes me sound like a dinosaur, but I do believe it. I do believe it. Maybe that will be completely different in 10 years. Maybe there'll be this staff for hire. You can bring in an editor to help you. You can bring in a graphic designer to help you. But I would just say, well, why aren't you publishing through Tiny Hardcore? Right? Why aren't you publishing through Midwestern Gothic? But let's say that you're publishing something that you want to give away as Christmas presents to people, or let's say you're convinced that the kind of thing you're writing is just not going to be attractive to any of these other people, but you know it's good. Let's say you've had friends that are serious writers who say this is good, it's polished, it's ready, you just can't find anybody who wants it. Then you self-publish and you sort of roll up your sleeves and get ready to do the very hard work of carrying that book all by yourself. But it can be done, and there's a lot of success stories. There's a lot of success stories of people who self-published, sold a lot of books, attracted the attention of people in alt publishing or traditional publishing, and kind of went on from there. I just think it's the hardest way. It's also the way that is going to cost the most time, and time is our most precious commodity. Nothing is more important than time. You could win $1 billion. And if somebody said to you, yes, you have $1 billion now, but you have to do this thing for 12 hours a day, every day, the $1 billion doesn't help your writing at all. What writers need is time, right? So the more time you have to put into marketing, promoting, sending out advanced copies yourself, the more stuff you have to do yourself, the less time that you are writing or living in that imaginative space that helps you write the next project. In a way, you could think about publishing as getting people to help you, right? This is how I get people to help me, so that I don't have to do all of it myself.
Any last, yeah, go ahead.
As I say, how do you get to the editor, past the overworked, overcaffeinated, and underpaid interns?
You mean for literary magazines?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's two ways. Obviously, the story has to be really good, but I think you also have to send it to a lot of places, because you have to assume that the interns. So what Cameron is saying is that most of the literary magazines, national literary magazines, have a volunteer staff of interns who read the slush pile, and they're very tired, and they've got a ton of things to read, and they're usually students. Sometimes they're grad students, which means they're overworked, underpaid, or not paid. Right, and they have this tendency, and this is what I talk about in my classes, they have this tendency to reject everything. Right, something's really got to jump out at them. So it has to be great. The writing has to be great. And then I think you have to send it to 10 places at a time. You have to send it to 10 or 12 places at a time. Even though some journals say no simultaneous submissions.
So when you send out 12 letters and
I don't send, well, we're talking about stories now, so we switched from novels to stories. When I send out stories or essays, unless I've been solicited by a journal, right, which means that I'm going to give this piece to them exclusively and see what they say, then I will usually send to 4 or 5 places at a time. But before I had a list of publications, I would send to 10. 10 was my number. The idea being that it's kind of a numbers game, and the chances of having your story or your essay accepted in 2 different markets at the same time is so slim. It just never. The only person I've known that had this happen is Bruce Bond, and he's sending out poems, and he's one of the most prolific and widely published poets in the United States. So of course Bruce is going to have 2 poems taken by a journal at the same time, and then he's going to have to conduct the delicate negotiations of telling one, I sent it to 2 places. But we don't have to, mortals like us don't have to worry about that. We can probably send it to 50 places and never risk having 2 journals taken at the same time. Yeah.
So that's for stories, right? What about novels? Is that the same thing goes?
Well, with the novel, if you're using the traditional model and you're sending out queries to agents, you can send 50 queries to 50 agents. There's no limit. Occasionally an agent will answer and say, I'm interested in this and I want an exclusive, which means that he or she wants to be the only agent looking at it for a certain period. So like, let's say the agent asks for a partial, but he wants you to agree to an exclusive, meaning that for a certain amount of time, you agree not to send the partial to any other agent. And that gets kind of tricky, right? If it's a very prestigious agent, you probably say yes. If it's somebody you've never heard of, you might have to say no, which is hard because it's somebody who's interested in your work. If you're not using an agent, if you're doing the alt-pub method, then my impression is that, again, you can send excerpts of novels or queries to these micropresses as widely as you like. You could send out 100 at a time if you want to. The old rule of thumb in traditional publishing was that you don't give up on your novel until you've been rejected by 100 agents. Because there's 500 agents, doing fiction of all, probably more.
But even if the agent says like no simultaneous submissions, it's okay.
No agents do that. Agents will allow you, and no agent says you can only send a query to me and to nobody else. None of them. None of them have sort of the policy where if you send a query to me, you can't send it elsewhere. They all understand that people who are trying to sell books are trying to sell books. They want you to sell your book, right? Even if they don't take it, they hope that you will land the book somewhere else. Like they want to see the book business thrive. They like that. The only time you get into trouble is if you are kind of working with an agent on a book. Let's say that the agent has expressed enough interest to say, well, I'd like to see some revisions. If you can make this change and this change and this change, send it back to me. So let's say you make those changes and you like the result, and then you start shopping the book to other agents. That's a little bit untoward. That's a little bit unethical. And then the danger there is that all the agents really are in New York, and they do talk to one another. And so if you kind of cheat one, word gets around, and you don't want that to happen. But no, you can submit as widely as you can stand sending emails. Yeah. It's complicated, guys, but I think the thing to remember is that if you're writing well and if you feel passionate about your writing, you're going to find readers who are passionate about your writing. You just have to be patient.
Thank you so much, Amos.
You're welcome.
Really lovely.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to pass out. I've got a little handout, and then I'll get out of your hair. So you guys can just pass that around. It's basically just a list of the things that I talked about, but I really appreciate the invitation, and I hope you have a great lunch. Should be enough copies of that. There's 40 people here. Good to see you, man. How are you? Yeah, yesterday was great, wasn't it? Amazing.